Hello. Welcome to the fourth in a series of live streams during which I will be uh, doing retopology, general modeling, and just generally character focused modeling work for AAA characters. This is the fourth episode, essentially, and during this one, I'm going to be focusing on taking this retopology that I did over the course of Tuesday's stream, and I'll be dumping it into ZBrush so that I can use this topology for a differently shaped head to sort of show the workflow that you can use without any really special tools to conform something that's meant for one head to a completely different head while retaining the same type of topology. So before I really get into that, I just want to cover a few of the basics that I've been covering over the course of previous streams, specifically, what this whole thing is about. I know I mentioned that it's about AAA character modeling, but in case you're just coming into this, you're not familiar with what this whole workshop's about. I'm running a program through Patreon in which I open up some slots so that people can one, well, they can just watch these streams, but two, after the streams start going live and then end, there's an hour of discussion period after that public stream, during which we talk about everything that I talked about during the stream, as well as other topics that they might want to bring up, whether it's something that they're working on, something that they were curious about during the stream. It could be as diverse as portfolio reviews or talking about working in the game industry, but it all sort of falls into the same sort of heading of working in AAA development from an artist point of view. So if that sounds pretty cool to you, we're about halfway through now, so it's a little late to sign up, but I still do have some slots open if you want to do a portfolio review or something like that. If that doesn't sound good to you, well, there's always these free streams. I will be recording all of these streams and then putting them online on YouTube after they've been taken off of Twitch. Though if you sign up for the program, you'll get them as soon as they're uploaded as opposed to having to wait a few days. So without further ado, let's talk about taking some pre-existing topology for something that is made for a fairly generic looking face. This face specifically is the Infinite Realities head scan. You might see it a lot on places like ArtStation if you happen to notice somebody working on, say, a skin shader or something like that. It's pretty popular for that type of thing because you can just download it online for free, and it comes with some displacement and color maps along with some pretty good UVs. But what I'm using it for right now is the basis for some retopology, which you can see right here. And the real point of this retopology is not just to retopologize this specific head, but rather to lay down topology for a generic head, a head that could be used across multiple characters throughout a game. The layout of this topology is very similar to what we use at Insomniac Games on Spider-Man PS4. It's very similar to what's used at Naughty Dog on the Uncharted series, and it's a topology layout that's basically just optimized for plugging into facial scanning and performance capture software so that you can capture as much detail as possible. So what that entails is adding details to the right places so that you have enough detail to capture that type of performance, along with having enough detail to capture sculptural details and things like skin texture. You'll notice that this guy has lots of skin texture on him, especially in places like his forehead, under his eyes. So part of the whole process of making this topology has been to concentrate areas in places where we would want to put a lot of detail into our sculpt, and by the same token, put a lot of detail into animation, things like, say, blend shapes or maps that fade in and out depending upon the character's facial expression, etc. So, with that in mind, let's actually take what we have here and get it ready for transferring over to ZBrush so that we can start transferring details over. Now, there are tools specifically for this type of workflow. One of them is, it's made by, it's a company I believe called, it's just Russian 3D Scanner. Basically what it does is you define landmarks on the low poly and high poly model, and then the algorithm that they use tries to find similarities and differences and try to project that model onto the mesh. There are similar things that you can do directly in ZBrush without having to have another third-party application. So that's what I'm sort of going to be going over tonight. And if I get to the point where I'm sort of repeating myself or not providing any more useful information, I'm going to be switching over to the werewolf character model that I had been working on at the beginning of this stream and start retopologizing its face and connecting its face and head to the rest of its body. So if things start to get a little slow, that's what I'll be jumping into. But for now, what we're going to do is add just a tiny bit more detail to a couple areas of this guy. And then we're going to do some very quick UVs just to get something down so that the UVs exist. And then we're going to take it over to ZBrush and actually conform that head to this scan right here. Now this is another free scan. I believe you can get it from 1024. I might be mistaken. It's been a while since I downloaded this model, but it's another freely available model that you can just go and find online by just Googling free head scans. And what I'll be doing is I will be moving and morphing all of the different shapes from this model to fit this one. There's going to be some work that I do to adjust the high poly model so that it works a little better, but I'll get to that when I get to it, which should be fairly soon. So let's add some detail to the area that I'm thinking of, which specifically is the eyes. And actually, we're going to do something right now. We're going to delete the inside of the mouth because that's not something that we're going to need right now for tonight. It's just going to sort of get in the way, especially since this guy does not actually have an interior to his mouth. As you can see, if I zoom in on here, it's just a solid shape. So I don't need a mouth interior. But if you're working in a game company or something like that, you'll probably retain the interior of the mouth and then sort of work around it. But we'll not worry about that for now. It's a fairly simple process, and it becomes self-explanatory once you start to understand the process of bringing that geometry in and projecting it onto this. So let's do that. Let's add some more detail to his eyes. Now, the reason that I want to add more detail to his eyes is that these eyes right here have some pretty uneven polygon distribution. You can see that I have these fairly narrow polygons right next to these fairly large polygons. So I want to even out this spacing, but I also want to add just one more loop in here so that from the side I can get a nice curve. If you look at the high poly here, you'll notice that the eyelid follows the curvature of the eyeball, so that's something that I want to retain as much of as possible. So we're just going to go to the topology mode here in Modo, and this is something that you can do in basically any other program where you can do retopology. So you really don't have to worry about this specific process that I'm using, just the placement of edge loops and that type of thing. It's less about the tools and more about the techniques that you use. And it looks like we have some bad geometry right here, so let's just cut into this a bit and then delete the unnecessary stuff. Oh, actually, that's not going to work. Here we go. So, there we go. So close this off and even out the spacing on these guys right here and here. We're also going to smooth out the shape of the eyelid. Now you notice that if you were watching last time or the time before that, I specifically laid out polygons so that polygons and edge loops so that they would intersect with the corner of the eye, and that's what I'm getting right now. I'm getting this nice intersection right here, and that's going to allow me to retain detail in this area right here, where you start to see the crow's feet going back like this. That's a nice area to retain detail in because it's also an area that deforms a lot. I've got a question in chat. Is it standard practice to model with the eyes closed? That's a very good question, and it actually depends on where you are working. However, a lot of what you will get from, say, 3D scanning stores or third-party folks who do 3D scanning for a living is actually either doing eyes fully closed or doing them in a sort of half-open state. And sometimes you'll actually get a blend shape included in the mesh to account for that. And basically what that does for you is it makes it so that when you have this area up here opening and closing on the eyelid, when the model is actually animating, you don't get as much stretching because this area actually gets a little bit more texture resolution. So you don't get as much stretching in this direction as you would if the eye was modeled fully open. However, if you are not modeling something at very, super high fidelity, it's pretty okay to have the eyes modeled open. You just want to keep in mind that if you have a scene where your character's eyes are fully closed for an extended period, you will notice some stretching. So you have to kind of account for that in how much detail you put into the eyelids. So one way that you can get around having that stretching is just by having more detail in the model itself. And at Insomniac, we have the eyes fully open most of the time, but they do usually have a blend shape that gets them to a half-closed or even fully closed state, depending upon the character we're working on and that type of thing. Another question that we've got is, how do you present the model during progress review when the eyes are half-closed? That's another good question, and the basic answer to that is that we just present them with the eyes open. Because we'll often have things like deformation layers in ZBrush, and I can scroll down here to, let's see, where are my layers? There they are. So you can actually have deformation layers in ZBrush, which are essentially blend shapes. And depending upon where you get your models from, who is producing them, how they're set up, you might actually have eye and mouth open and closed shapes. That's something that we have in Insomniac, and they're very basic. They're just there to get the general landmarks in place. They don't have, a ton of excessive detail modeled or sculpted in, but they're nice to have if you want to clean up certain areas. However, we generally don't worry about them after we're done with the high poly sculpting state, just simply because we don't find them terribly useful most of the time. However, there are some occasions where you might run into problems with bad stretching on the upper eyelid, and that's where that type of blend shape would come in handy. If you find that you're getting lots of stretching, or you have a character who has their eyes closed very often, it's probably worth your time to do things like adjust the UVs or adjust the model itself or the positioning of certain things in the model so that you don't have to worry about that kind of stretching. So let's add that loop in there, just like so. And now you can see that from the side, let's move this over a little bit. From the side, if I move this up into the middle of the crease, you see that there's just a very slight amount of positive curvature here. This will be enough enough detail to capture that type of curvature, and then once we transfer that over to here, we'll just start morphing stuff into the right shape. But for now, let's just make sure this is completely symmetrical. Let's just delete all the stuff we don't need and then mirror it back over. Oh my goodness. Moto's not cooperating right now, but that's okay. We'll work around it. There we go. And make sure that this seam is completely flat and centered. We'll mirror this. Now what we're going to do is just export this as an OBJ and import it into ZBrush after doing some very basic UVs. So let's do the UVs now. And really the UVs are only there so that we can more easily project certain types of details, but it's not something we're going to run into too much today. It's mainly for when you are projecting things like polypaint or you know, cavity maps or something that you're really going to need UVs. But it's just good practice to have UVs already when you're in ZBrush so that even if you don't need them immediately, you have them when you do need them. So let's just lay out some basic seams. And I've got a nice area right here where I can cut across the forehead. Alright. So let's unwrap this. Alright, so this standard unwrap that it gave me is alright, but it does have some problems. Specifically, it has problems with the face taking up a lot less space than areas like the neck. Now, people aren't going to be looking at the neck as much as they will be looking at the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. So that can present some problems. So what you'll generally want to do is increase the size of the face relative to the rest of the model on the UVs so that you get better texture resolution in the most important areas. I'm just going to do a general relax for this though, because I don't have a ton of work that I want to do on the UVs right now. I'm going to be saving most of the UV work for the final week of this workshop and then going from there. So let's just pull this down, pull this down. Let's pull that. And that'll sort of kind of work. It very clearly has some problems, like the mouth being a big weird shape. However, once again, I just need some UVs to exist. I don't really need the UVs to be pretty right now. Especially with the amount of resolution that we're going to be pumping into this model, what we'll be able to do is put a lot of that resolution into a high-res texture like a 4096 or an 8K texture, and then crunch it down later on and reproject it and that type of thing. So let's save this, and we'll actually, you know, we'll save this as an OBJ and then import it straight into ZBrush. If Moto doesn't completely freak out, you know, Moto freaking out is always an option, but you know, it's the same story with Maya or Max or any other program. Dum-de-dum-de-dum. Sorry about the delay here. So let's just save this out as an OBJ and bring it into ZBrush. And then we can start aligning the low poly and the high poly so that they'll work better together. So let's just insert a poly mesh, import it, and oops, make sure that that's saved out to the right location. I'm not looking at the right location. There we go. Okay, so we do have some scale issues here. So let's just make sure that these are both at the proper scale. And that's something that you'll want to keep an eye on in ZBrush. There are some export and import commands that you'll want to be aware of. So something that you'll want to make sure of is that when you import something or export something, it doesn't have incorrect offsets. We'll do the same for each one just so that we know that everything's fine. Okay. Alrighty, good. So now what we can do to make sure that these are both at the same scale, if you don't have a specific scale that you're working in, is if you go to deformation and unify, what this will do is it'll make it so that whatever subtool you're on is, I believe, I might be mistaken, but I believe it's a 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter box. Let's see, we have a question in the chat. So you bake with the eyes closed, blend shape layer on. It depends on the process that we're using and the final results that we want for the specific character, if we would bake with the eye closed blend shape on. I personally haven't done any baking with the eyes closed simply because I haven't needed to. Also, since the blend shapes don't actually affect UVs, it's just not something that I'm really going to have to worry about most of the time, because no matter what, whether I have the blend shape or not, I'm still going to have the same resolution in the UVs. And we use completely standard UVs at Insomniac, and a lot of other companies will use completely standardized UVs for heads as well. So that's one area where sometimes you'll just have to live with the fact that certain areas of the model are not as high resolution as other areas, or sometimes they'll have stretching in certain areas. But usually that's not a problem. And you won't have to worry about doing it with the eyes closed or halfway closed or something, unless there are specific reasons that you want them to be closed. So let's just unify both of these. There we go. Okay, so now they are at the same relative scale, and here we can see that there are some misalignment issues. Now, that's something that you probably could have guessed that there would be just right off the bat, judging by how different those heads were from the outset. However, the high poly specifically has some problems with it that are not present in the low poly. So let's go back over here and take a look at this model. Now, if you look at this model, you'll notice that, say, from a side view, it is looking, well, if it had its eyes open, the eyes would be looking straight ahead, and the face would be set up so that the face itself, the plane of the face, is facing essentially straight forward. Now, that's not the case with the high poly that we have here, so I will turn off our low poly. Now, viewing this from the side without perspective turned on, you can see that the plane of the face is actually angled slightly upwards. So what that's doing is it's sort of messing with the alignment of all the features of his face. So what we're going to need to do is align the high poly with the low poly, and then from there start aligning pieces of the low poly with the high poly. So we'll just rotate this and make sure that we have perspective turned off and mirroring turned off. So we can just rotate it like so and try to match the general locations of eyes and mouth. The corners of the mouth and the corners of the eyes are the two key areas that you sort of want to align, because everything aside from those areas is very easy to align. It's those two corners, the corners of the eyes and the corners of the mouth, that are difficult to align properly. So sometimes you'll have to rescale the low poly or the high poly to actually hit the right placement. So I'm going to rescale the low poly, also be a little faster and easier. So here we go. So we're going to rescale it so that the eyes move up the same locations as on the high poly. There we go. That's all right. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start dragging things around and projecting. And we're going to project the large shapes first. We're going to start from the general and work towards the specific. So the first step of that is to probably turn off symmetry, because this guy's face is simply not symmetrical. And then I'm just going to start using the move tool and projection to start getting things like the shape of the back of his head correct and that type of thing. So let's just do that. So let's move things as closely as possible and then start projecting. Make sure that my move intensity is 100%. And here we go. So we're going to pull in the back of the head. We can actually smooth this. That'll help get that shape shaved down a bit. We're going to pull the ear in. And this is a case where you'll want to be looking at the model from as many angles as possible, because even if it looks right from one angle, it might be completely wrong from another. So make sure to rotate around your model as much as possible so that you can get everything in the little nooks and crannies. Alright, we're going to mask this off so that we can move the neck up, like so. And we're going to move this up and in, this up, smooth things out. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start selecting areas that I just want to project onto the largest shapes and setting it up so that I can actually do some projection on them. So this masked out area is going to be the area that I project first, and generally the areas that I will project are things like the scalp, the neck, the cheeks and cheekbones, any of the large planes of the head and neck. Those are areas where I will start projecting detail very early just so that I can get general shapes correct. And then I'll start going more and more specific with things like ears, nose, eyes, mouth, etc. So we're going to mask these areas out. And then once they're all masked, we're going to actually invert that. And in projection, we just hit project all. And you might have to adjust the distance that it uses. You might have to hit it a couple times to actually get in there, but you'll notice that when I turn that off, the shape of his head has drastically changed to match that of the high poly. So there are some areas that are not going to be perfect, like the sort of hump on the back of his neck right here. That's just simply an area where you're going to have to sculpt detail in, because he simply doesn't have that information back there. However, this is also not an area that a lot of people are going to be looking at too much, so you don't have to worry about it too much. All right, so let's go back to our low poly. let's start moving around some of the more specific features of his face. So it looks like the corner of the mouth is not quite aligned right here, so we're going to move that. We're also going to move the lips around a bit. Move this corner of the mouth out a little. And if I use the Move Topological brush, what I can do is I can select areas that are close to each other but not connected. So, for example, I might want to move just the upper lip, and I can do that with the Move Topological. It's going to do this type of thing, where I'm not adjusting the lower lip, I'm just adjusting the upper lip. Alright. Now let's mask this off and do some projection. Alright, cool. Let's take a look at that. That's pretty okay. We're going to do the same thing with the lower lip and the chin. Mask off the chin and lower lip. Project that. See how it's looking. Yeah, looks like it's starting to match the very asymmetrical shapes of his head pretty well. It's not perfect. It still has some issues with the general silhouette, but we're going to take care of those over the next few minutes. So I'm just going to start doing the same thing that I've been talking about over the past few minutes, just moving stuff into place, and then once I have everything moved into place, I'm going to start working on the rest of the process. But until that point, I'm just going to probably have my mic off for a little bit, just since I don't really have too much to say. And then from there, I'm going to start talking about the finer details and stuff like that. So here we go. All right, so then now that we've gotten most of the basic shapes in place for the entire head, it's time to start thinking about where this is going to go next. Because, I mean, obviously, this is not going to be suitable for most uses. There's not enough detail to really put to use either animation-wise or just to kind of look at. It's still very chunky, especially in the silhouette around areas like the nose and the chin. So it's time to sort of start bumping up the subdivision levels and getting finer and finer detail in here. So let's go up one subdivision level and follow the same process. We're going to use projection and just generally mushing stuff around with the move tools. And we're also going to then start working on areas where there isn't very good polygon distribution. There's some small things that you can do in ZBrush that allow you to reproject the layout of or rather the spacing of the polygons and not just the placement. So we'll get into that in just a second. Meanwhile, let's start reprojecting some stuff from the high poly. So once again, we'll start from the general and work towards specific areas. Start with the biggest, flattest planes and go towards things that have much tighter detail, like the eyes, the nose, the ears, etc. In this case, we're lucky because we now have more geometry. That means we can project onto much more tightly controlled areas when we mask them off. This is much higher res, and that's nice to work with. Here we go. So we're going to do the cheeks and the top of the head all at the same time, as opposed to doing them very separately. We can do the chin as well. Some more of the neck. Probably not much of the ear right now, because the ear is one of those very detailed, tightly packed in spots that can introduce a lot of projection errors. The area behind the ear, however, doesn't have much detail at all, and it will often be very small on your UVs, so you don't have to concentrate on it very much. There we go. Alright, are there any areas that we missed? Yeah, we'll do this area right here, that area right there. We can also go across the bridge of the nose, because that doesn't actually have too much detail in it. Just one big, large form. That holds true of most humanoid characters. Alright, now let's invert that. All these masked off areas are the areas that are not going to receive projection. So let's project a little more. And now you start to see a lot more unique detail coming through. There's even the hint of some stubble on top of his head. You can see a lot more wrinkles on his neck, just a lot more structure everywhere. Alrighty. And at this point, after I've already done one subdivision, I will occasionally like to bump up to higher subdivision levels just to make sure I'm getting the general silhouette right, do some projection at this higher subdivision level, and then go back down through the subdivision levels and refine some of the larger shapes. So let's do some of that right now. Let's get some nice crunchy detail on his scalp and his neck. Get those nice forehead wrinkles in there as well. And the stuff right up there by the bridge of the nose where it meets the eyebrows. Alrighty, that's better. Now we're starting to see a lot more of that detail come through, and as we step down the subdivision levels, it will retain that detail and it will retain those nice shapes as we go up or down. And from this point, I'll continually reproject and mask, reproject, mask, and reproject. And always be conscious of where the masking is and make sure that it's on the largest planes possible. And once again, work from general to specific. I'm not going to work on the insides of the nostrils right now, but I'll certainly work on these large planes of the cheeks and lips and the top of the nose. And then from there I can start getting more detailed with the areas under the eyes, the cheekbones. I can get some stuff on the chin here. And probably the last areas that I will actually start projecting are the corners of the eyes and the corners of the mouth, because just like aligning those two areas when we are just aligning the models in general, they provide some difficult to reach areas for projection, so sometimes you need to do some manual sculpting. Alright. Now it looks like he's wearing a mud mask, but that's okay. So let's project some detail onto these large planes. Alrighty, so this is looking pretty good. Getting lots more nice detail. Let's bump up, project again, and one of the nice things about projecting in this way is that you get areas like the nasolabial fold in there, and then at lower subdivision levels you start to see it a lot more. Now, speaking of the nasolabial fold, we do have some problems here, and this is something that I wanted to get into specifically with these two heads, the sort of base head and the wrinkly old man head that we're working on. This guy has very pronounced nasolabial folds right along here, and that's great. It'll look good once it's baked, and with the right blend shapes and such, it'll look good. However, if you don't have the geometry there to support it, it's just going to look kind of weird and crunchy in the bake. We have a question in the chat. Would these different subdivision levels be used as LODs for the character? The answer for that is it depends. In a lot of cases, yes, they could be used as different LODs, but unless you are doing manual creation of level detail models, which is not really suggested right now because most characters like this are so complex and you'll have so many of them that it's tough to get all that work done manually. So in a lot of cases you'll just run into, using automated tools that generate LODs for you. And basically what most of those tools do is they take the existing model and they just start throwing data away, as opposed to using the topology in really smart ways. So if you wanted to manually create the level detail models for this character, sure, you could absolutely use these different subdivision levels, and I would probably end up using either this subdivision level or this subdivision level for the final model, but I would prefer to never have to touch LODs in my life ever again, because I've had to make them a lot and they're never fun. They're always a pain, and they're one of the things that can be and should be automated. So if you don't have an automated solution for LODs, you should try to press to get one of those, either through your own means or by using the right channels at your studio to get software that does LODs. Alright, so I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to start putting more detail, projecting stuff, and probably not doing too much commentary for a while, since once again this is the type of thing where there isn't as much to narrate after a certain point. So once I actually get to the point where I need to start narrating again, I absolutely will. But for now, I'm just going to essentially turn off the sound and just get back to sculpting and projection. Alright, so I'm probably not going to go through the process of doing the entire head right now because I think um, the the process that I've shown kind of gives a good example of the general process that you'll go through for an entire head, especially for things like this ear, which can present problems because it has so many overlapping shapes and such. But there is one more thing that I want to touch on, which is very handy, and it's a specific feature of ZBrush that makes it so that certain problem areas, like the say the area in here or along this the ridge of the ear right here, provide you with slightly fewer problems, and that has to do with the under the deformation menu right here. There is an option for that says relax by projection. And what that does is it takes the general shape of the mesh, retains the volume, but shifts the position of the vertices so that they're much more evenly distributed. It relaxes their positions while retaining the volume. And this is really handy for areas like you can see right here, where there is a nice curve that goes along this shape, but then gets a little wiggly right around here. So what I'm going to do in this area to, instead of having to resculpt that or smooth it or something, I'm just going to mask that little area off. Oops. Right here. I'm going to use relax. Let's see what it does. Okay, that's a little too heavy, but let's try a lower value. No, Let's try subdividing and then trying that again, because occasionally it will freak out if your model scale is weird or any number of other things. Even masking can affect this negatively, but we try. Well, apparently it doesn't want to right now because, well, ZBrush hates me. But you get the general idea, I think. Essentially, if you have a bunch of polygons that retain a nice shape, but they're kind of like offset like this, and smoothing wouldn't help, and you get some weird artifacts like this that are hard to cover up from multiple subdivision levels, you can just usually select an area like that and then relax it, and that should fix a lot of the issues. This is something that we run into a lot at work when we have areas, say tightly projected areas around the eyes that have very, very fine lines. Occasionally, somebody will have run, say, an inflation brush around some of those really tight details, and what that ends up doing is makes them so that they sort of overlap with each other in very strange ways. So that's one quick way to counteract the sort of weird offset that you saw there. Let's do one more little projection just on the top of his eyes, just to get that nice detail in there. And then I think for the next hour, I'm going to start. Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah, he's got some nice volume in there now. Well, yeah, that's the general process that I use just in ZBrush for reprojecting geometry from one head onto another. It's very simple, but it can just be a laborious process, especially if you have somebody whose whose face doesn't quite match the original model you have. There's a bit of work that you might have to do. But from this point, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to Modo, and I'm going to start retopologizing the head of the werewolf model that I had last week. So let's just open that up, and let's actually give this guy a head. Now I'm going to use the same type of topology layout and the same techniques that I've been using for laying down topology on his head. It'll just be very slightly differently arranged. However, I'm going to still have things like loops going around the mouth, loops going around the eyes, and then support loops going around some of the other major features of the head. So as I start laying out this geometry, it'll become plain that the same types of topology are here and here. It'll be the same general layout with loops going around like that, like this, but then the placement, say, of loops going up to, say, the forehead might be a little bit different. So let's get that started right now. Let's just come in here to topology and start using the same process that I used before, just by laying out basic shapes that I can then subdivide and conform to the underlying model. And once again, these are not new techniques, but you will see that I'm connecting parts of the model in slightly different ways. So instead of, say, bridging the lower eyelid area to the top of the nose up here, I'm probably going to end up bridging, say, parts of the upper lip across the top of the nose, because it makes more sense to have topology going along here as opposed to up and around like this. So let's just get started. Alrighty, so I'm starting to approach the last 15-20 minutes of the stream here, and this is usually the point where I start taking more questions from anybody who's actually stuck around this long. And then once it hits about 9 p.m. Pacific time, in about 19 minutes, looks like, I'm gonna hop into the private Google Hangout with any of the program members who are currently still awake. I know it's been a long week for some folks, so yeah. Um, but if you have any questions about anything that I covered on the stream tonight, feel free to fire away. I know tonight was a little bit light on content, partially because the content goes this specific content goes fairly quickly, and partially just because I did want to demonstrate some of the same techniques that I use for retopo for normal heads on this guy. So it was more just an excuse, or not excuse, but an exercise in using the same techniques for a vastly different model. So hence the you know, lightness of how things are going. But if you have any questions or anything you want to comment on, even anything about, say, working in the game industry or anything along those lines, I'm happy to answer to the best of my ability over the next few minutes. And feel free to put those questions in the Twitch chat. And if there's nothing, well, I'll just keep on modeling this guy for the next few minutes and then cut off the stream at 9 p.m. So a question I got in the chat right now is whether I will be covering hair card modeling. Yes, I do plan on talking a bit about making hair cards. That's probably going to be during the last week of this workshop, either the 29th or the 31st of August. And I'm going to be covering the general process that I use for laying out hair cards at around the same time that I'm talking about things like UVs for characters and laying out topology with UVs in mind for the future. So yeah, that's definitely something I want to cover. And I actually do want to put some hair cards on this model. I want to actually make it so this big lumpy neck of his is covered in fur cards that go and sort of fill out this shape, break the silhouette, that type of thing. And I also plan on adding hair cards to this model's face along these sort of wispy, spiky pieces of fur along here. So that's definitely something I'm going to cover. And I'm also just going to cover general theory behind laying out hair cards, because it can be kind of confusing the first time you try to put hair cards down, especially on a fairly realistic model. So that's certainly something I'll be talking about. It's probably not going to be incredibly in-depth, because once you get the basic concepts of laying out hair cards, it sort of does the job itself once you know the basics of it. But yes, it will be covered, though not in some sort of incredible depth, since despite its initial difficulty, it's not a terribly deep subject. Another question I'm getting is, what is the average poly count you usually work with a creature like this? What's a comfortable standard nowadays across AAA studios? I hear 100k, but with stylized stuff, I wonder if that's too high. What's the density you want to hit with this one, hair included? The final polygon density that I'm looking for, the final polygon count that I'm looking for this guy is, well, let's see, what are we looking at right now? This is, so it's without any hair cards, without a finished face, no teeth, no claws, no hands. It's sitting at about 36,000 triangles. And this right here, what you see, this is about the density that I'm going for. There are some areas where I'm going to be taking away polygons or adding some more. The tail especially is a little too dense right now for it to be, I don't know, it's just more dense than it needs to be, so I'm probably going to end up removing some of those loops. And other areas, like the feet, I'm going to be adding a couple more loops just for slightly better deformation around, say, you know, some of these joints in here. I think by the time I'm done, after I've modeled out some of the small accessories that I want to make, including some very rough clothes and some sort of shackles around his wrists with dangling chains and some other stuff, it's probably going to end up being roughly 100,000 triangles. And, you know, that is... I wouldn't necessarily say average, but that's in the ballpark of what of a lot of things that I do at work, and that's in the ballpark of a lot of characters you might see in, say, Uncharted or Tomb Raider. You know, the latest Tomb Raider games, not the old ones with the triangle boobs. But yeah, 100,000 triangles is more or less what I'm aiming for. I don't have a specific number in mind, and I'm not going to worry too much about that number because honestly, there's so much work that gets done when the model gets put into an engine to optimize it that poly count is not something I need to worry about as much as complexity of shaders, amount of overdraw for things like hair cards. That can have a significant performance impact. So the number of hair cards that are resting on top of each other, especially if they have soft shading as opposed to alpha cutout shading, that will also drastically impact the performance of the model in game. So those are things that I'm going to be looking at more than the actual final polygon count. I want to make sure that this guy's shaders, his final shaders, which I'll be doing after this workshop is over, I'll make sure that they are not overly complex, and I'll make sure that the textures aren't too large. I still want this thing to be technically usable in a game, even if it's just a personal project. So those are some things I'm going to keep in mind. Poly count doesn't worry me as much, and it generally doesn't worry most other folks, simply because things like GPUs and current gen consoles are highly optimized for displaying millions and millions and millions of polygons, especially when you have things like tessellation. I would say that for your personal portfolio work, once again, don't worry too much about a strict poly count, because that's not what people are looking at so much these days. It's more about how you use your polygons and the way that they're laid out. So, for example, do you have enough loops around your elbows? Are things going to deform properly when they're rigged? Are they going to, you know, is the pose of the model right, and did you distribute the polygons along that pose correctly? Those are the things that people are going to be looking for a lot more than they'll be looking for a specific number. And in a lot of cases, they won't even look at the number of polygons. They'll just say, they'll look at the model, see that it's about this dense, think, okay, it's kind of dense, but it's not too bad. What do the shaders look like? So that's something to sort of keep in mind. It's less about polygon count these days and a lot more about shaders, post-processing, the general complexity of things like hair. These are the things that are really expensive. Additionally, when I get into doing hair cards for this guy, they're going to be fairly stylized, and I'm going to show some different ways of creating those hair cards in both realistic and stylized manners, but the final result is going to be a lot more stylized. And I'm going to be going for a sort of, well, not quite necessarily League of Legends type of look, but similar nice solid shapes to a lot of the things that they have. Sort of a Blizzard Riot sort of hybrid style that has lots of silhouette breakup from hair cards, along with nice, nice flaring from ripped pants and that type of thing. So I've got about 8 minutes left on the stream now before I start heading over to the private Google Hangout. So if there are any more questions that you have before I just head off, feel free to drop them in the chat over the next few minutes, and I'll try to answer them if I can. If I can't, I will make stupid noises and then try to avoid the question, as I do in most situations, but, you know, whatever. We'll figure it out. We'll get through it together. Meanwhile, I'm just going to make sure that this guy is nice and sealed up along some of the weird edges. So another question I'm getting in the chat right now is, this may be too complicated a topic, but what are draw calls? Draw calls are, well, it is a pretty complicated topic, and it's something that you could, say, look up on Wikipedia or whatever. But draw calls generally have to do with the number of objects that are being drawn on the screen and the number that they take to fully render that object. So, for example, rendering a simple polygon without any textures on it will probably only be a few draw calls. Those draw calls are basically just commands sent to the rendering hardware that say, okay, do X, Y, and Z thing to display some sort of data on the screen. So, for example, with just a simple polygon, adding, for example, a blend shape to that polygon that morphs it in three-dimensional space might add a draw call, depending upon how the shader works or how blend shapes work in your engine. Sometimes they don't add draw calls, sometimes they make it so that it's more, effective to render. It really depends. Draw calls also have a lot to do with shaders and how shaders interact with the rendering system in whatever engine you're using. So basically what happens is when a draw call happens, it looks at what's on the screen or what should be rendered and says, okay, I'm going to separate out all the different aspects of the shader into these component parts, similarly to layers in Photoshop, and this is going to composite them together. So you might actually have multiple draw calls for what I have on screen right now. There might be a separate draw call for the vertices that are highlighted and the vertices that are not highlighted. You might have a separate draw call for the highlight that just happens when I mouse over one but don't click on it. You might have a separate draw call for the background mesh, and so the background mesh, and one for the foreground mesh, and then they're composited somehow. Complex shaders that involve lots of different things being rendered all at once tends to increase the number of draw calls. And you know, this is a drastic oversimplification of some very complex stuff. There are other aspects of rendering games that you wouldn't even think would add draw calls, but do, depending upon the rendering software that's being used, the method of rendering. There are lots of different methods of rendering, and each one may add or subtract draw calls. But shaders in general are the biggest offender when it comes to draw calls, because a single shader on a character, one, for example, that's supposed to do skin, which has a lot of very complex math involved and a lot of different layers of things like specularity, just general albedo color, subsurface scattering. It might have many draw calls, and each one would be, it could represent a different part of that shader, or it could represent any number of parts of, you know, math that are going into the shader. It sort of depends on, like I said, it sort of depends on how your rendering software and hardware handles this type of thing. Different rendering software and hardware handle draw calls differently, because some of them use different math to represent the same things. Some of them use completely different shading systems. For example, there are two common methods of calculating specular highlights on a model. There is Blin Fong, and there is GGX. They were developed at different times to do slightly different things, and you know, GGX is a lot more complex and slow to render than Blin Fong is, but it also tends to look better. But it might also add more draw calls if you have a GGX shader as opposed to a Blin Fong shader. So all these different type of things add into the draw calls that are being shown on screen, and draw calls in the end are all composited together to get the final image that you see with, you know, fancy lighting effects, textures, normal maps, etc. So how that would affect character modeling decisions would be that there are certain types of things you would want to do to decrease the number of draw calls. For example, if I had, so if this character had, say, some piercings through his ears that are just little like metal studs or rings or something, and he also had some sort of satchel, say, that was strung across his chest, which is actually something I might add now that I think about it. You could have the earrings and the satchel represented using two different shaders, you know, with that in mind, you would probably have them on two separate sets of UVs, or to increase the efficiency and lower the number of draw calls, what you could do is have the satchel and the earrings use the same shader, and what that'll do is it will decrease the number of draw calls, especially if those two things didn't necessarily need to have two separate shaders on them. And what you could do is you could have the earrings, the satchel, all in the same UV space, using all the same textures, using all the same shader, but just be located on different parts of the model. Those are the types of things that will inform your 3D modeling decisions, but more how they'll inform your UV and texturing decisions. And I hope that makes sense. I hope that's just a good general overview of how that can affect things for you. Now we are reaching the end of our time tonight. I know tonight was a little lighter on talking and explanations than previous nights, but I promise that next week, especially talking about things like hands, there will be a lot of breaking down shapes, breaking down topology, talking about the best methods for laying out positions of edge loops and other things on hands. I'll be talking about how to attach hands to the rest of the arm, because that can be kind of complicated depending upon what restrictions you're under, especially if you have the entire arm and hand visible at the same time, and isn't like something handy like a sleeve or a cuff or something. And hands are going to take up a pretty big chunk of time because, one, hands can be difficult to make, and two, there are multiple methods of making hands and making things like knuckle topology. So you'll want to be aware of each one of those things, and I'll go through each one of those things, and I'll also demonstrate some ways to speed up the workflow of modeling hands and modeling hands at different levels of detail. So hopefully you tune in next week. It'll be at the same time on Tuesday and Thursday, and yeah, it'll be all hands all the time, and probably to go along with hands next week, I'm going to be talking just a little bit about hard surface stuff specifically for character artists. I'm not going to get too in-depth with it, but I'll probably mention a few things, especially since I want this guy to have some shackles around his wrists. I'll be talking about placement of those, placement of edge loops on wrists and such, where you would want to put things like wrist accessories or rings, that type of thing. So hopefully that will be helpful and interesting. And now I'm going to hop into the private Google Hangout with the people who signed up for the workshop. So have a good night. I'll see you guys next week, and I'll be getting the recordings up from this week up before the next streams start. So have a good night, and thank you very much. Have a good weekend.